The first time the neighbors noticed the dog, he was sitting completely still on the front steps of the small white house at the end of the street. His golden fur was dusty and tangled, and his eyes were fixed on the closed door as if the world behind it held everything that mattered. Morning passed into afternoon, and still he did not move except to shift his weight once or twice and to lick his paws. Children rode their bikes by and pointed at him. A delivery truck rumbled past and splashed water from the gutter. People came and went from the other houses. Yet the dog stayed right there in front of the widow Mary Thompson's house. That was the first day. On the second day he came again and sat in the same spot. On the third day as well. And soon everyone on the street was talking about the dog who would not leave the doorstep of the lonely widow. If you believe that kindness and second chances can still heal broken hearts, then please like and comment and share and subscribe. Your small action helps stories of love and mercy reach more people who need hope. Mary was in her late 60s and she lived alone in that little house in a quiet American town. Her husband Frank had died 2 years earlier after a fire in an old apartment building on the other side of the city. He had been a firefighter for most of his life. He had gone into burning buildings when everyone else was running out. The night he never came back, something inside Mary collapsed and had never stood up again. Since then, her life had become a string of silent days. The curtains stayed half closed and the television murmured in the background, though she rarely watched it. The mailbox filled with bills and charity flyers, and the occasional card from distant relatives who did not visit. She stopped going to church. She stopped baking pies for the neighbors. People would see her only occasionally through the frosted glass of the door as she signed for a package, then vanished again into the dim hallway. What no one on the street knew at first was that the dog had not come from nowhere. His name was Ranger, and he had once belonged to Frank. Frank had found him as a young pup behind the fire station years before, muddy and shivering and abandoned. He brought the pup home in his arms and told Mary that every hero needed a partner. Ranger grew up running beside the fire truck and riding in the back seat when Frank went on calls that were allowed to bring a dog. He waited at the door every night for Frank to come home, and he slept at the foot of their bed. When the fire that took Frank's life burned out, Ranger lay for hours at the front door whining softly, ears straining for footsteps that would never return. After the funeral, he refused to leave Frank's boots that stood by the closet. He curled himself around them and refused to eat. It was as if he had decided that if he could not follow his partner into the flames, he would stay at his last known place and keep guard. Mary could not handle it. Every time she looked at Ranger, she saw Frank smile and heard his voice and smelled the smoke that had seeped into his uniform. Her grief turned sharp and heavy. She shouted at Ranger more than once, told him to stop scratching the door, told him to stop looking at her like that. In her pain, she convinced herself that the dog was a reminder she did not want. One day, after a long night of crying, she opened the back gate and told a neighbor to take Ranger away to a shelter or anywhere else. She watched from the window as the dog was led away, his head low, his tail dragging like a flag of surrender. The moment the gate closed behind him, the house felt colder. But Mary told herself it was better this way. She told herself she could not carry all that sadness in one body. Ranger did not understand why he had been taken away. He did not understand the shelter or the noise or the cold cage. For months he lived between concrete walls, listening to the sounds of other lost animals. Some were adopted. Some were not. People passed his kennel and called him a good boy and gave him treats, but no one took him home. Then one day a volunteer did not close the gate properly after cleaning. There was a gap just big enough for a determined dog with a strong memory. Ranger slipped out silent as a shadow. He followed the faint thread of scent and instinct through streets and across intersections and along river paths he had walked before with Frank. It took him almost a full day to find it. The small white house at the end of the street. Frank's house, Mary's house, his home. From that day on, he came back every single morning and sat at the front door. He did not bark. He did not scratch. He simply waited. The neighbors wondered why the widow did not chase him away. The truth was that Mary saw him through the thin curtain on the first day and every day after. The first time she saw the familiar golden fur and the way he sat exactly the way he used to when he heard Frank's car. She almost dropped the cup in her hands. Her heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to fling the door open and bury her fingers in his fur and feel that he was real. Yet she also wanted to scream and tell him to go away, because his presence tore open wounds she had wrapped tightly. So she did nothing. She stood where he could not see her and watched him sit in the rain and in the wind and in the pale winter light. Every day he returned. Every night he left only when the sky was dark and the street lamps flickered on. A young woman named Claire who lived across the street worked at a nearby diner. She noticed the dog and started leaving scraps of chicken and bits of burger for him after her late shift. She would cross the road, quietly set the food near the steps and step back. Ranger would look at the door once, as if checking if a different hand would place the bowl, then eat slowly. One evening, Claire knocked on Mary's door and asked gently if the dog was hers. Mary said no in a voice that sounded like someone else. Claire hesitated because she saw something in the older woman's eyes, a flash of pain and recognition as she glanced past Claire toward the dog. But Mary closed the door before any more questions could rise. The questions, however, rose anyway in Claire's mind and in the minds of the neighbors. Why did the widow never call animal control? Why did the dog sit so still and so loyal? When the first snow began to fall and Ranger still came and laid his head on the doorstep, Claire could not bear it. She brought an old blanket from her apartment and gently placed it on the step. The next morning she saw Ranger curled on it, his breath fogging the air. When she went to work, she told the story to a regular customer who happened to be a retired firefighter from another town. He listened quietly, then asked her for the name of the widow and the street. Something in the description had scratched at his memory. A few days later he drove down that very street, and when he saw the golden dog outside the White House, his eyes filled with tears. He recognized the dog from a photograph that had been passed around the station. The late Frank Thompson and his partner Ranger standing in front of a burned house, both covered in soot and ash, yet both alive and proud. The retired firefighter got out of the car and walked to the door. When Mary opened it and saw his uniform jacket, she almost fainted. He told her that the whole department had heard about Frank's last call, how he had gone back inside the building to rescue a trapped child, how the beam had fallen, how he had pushed a rookie out of the way and taken the hit himself, how Ranger had pulled at his coat and howled until the others went back in and dragged him out, though it was too late. The firefighter told Mary that in their station they said Ranger was the last one who refused to leave Frank's side, that the dog had lain beside the locker where Frank's helmet still hung long after the funeral, that eventually they had given him back to her because they believed he belonged with her. Mary stood there shaking as the memories crashed over her like waves. Then the man said the words that finally shattered the shell she had built around her heart. He said that sometimes the ones left behind carry more guilt than the ones who are gone. He said perhaps she had pushed Ranger away because she blamed him for surviving when Frank did not. Perhaps she thought that if she erased every trace of the life they had built together, the pain would become easier. But he reminded her of something Frank had said once during a training meeting, that if anything ever happened to him, everyone should look out for Mary and Ranger because they were his world. Mary sank to the floor by the open door, and for the first time in 2 years she let herself sob without holding back. Through her tears she saw Ranger slowly stand and take a hesitant step toward her. His tail moved just a little. His eyes searched her face for permission. She whispered his name, a name she had not spoken since the day she let him go. Ranger. And that was all it took. He climbed the one remaining step and pressed his head into her chest with a heavy sigh, as if coming home at last. Mary wrapped her arms around his neck and held on like she was holding on to her husband and to every memory she had been running from. The retired firefighter stepped back and wiped his face because the scene in front of him was too sacred for any witness. From that day on, the street saw a new picture. The lonely house with the closed curtains slowly changed. The curtains were pulled back. The front porch was swept. A small bowl of water and a bed were placed beside the door and then moved inside. Mary started walking Ranger each morning. At first she held herself, stiff and quiet, but as weeks passed, neighbors heard her talking softly to him, telling him stories about Frank, about the early years of their marriage, and about the life they had lost. In answering her silence, Ranger wagged his tail and nudged her hand, and sometimes simply sat beside her in the park while she looked at the sky with eyes that were no longer entirely empty. If this story touched something deep inside you, then please like and share and subscribe. It helps this channel grow and brings more gentle stories of love and loyalty to people who have forgotten that such things still exist. Before we end, I want to ask you something from the heart. Tell me in the comments what loyalty means to you. Just one line from your heart, maybe about a pet you loved or a person who never left your side. Your words might be the reason someone else keeps believing in kindness. In time, people stopped calling Mary the lonely widow at the end of the street. They began calling her the lady with the golden dog. Children waved at Ranger when he passed by. Claire from across the street came over for coffee on Sundays. Sometimes they would all sit on the porch and Mary would laugh softly at something Ranger did. The house still carried sorrow and always would, because love that deep leaves marks that never fade. Yet the sorrow no longer swallowed her whole. Inside that house the truth had once been unbearable. A woman who had lost everything and had pushed away the last living piece of her husband's love. Now the truth inside was different. A woman learning slowly to forgive herself. A dog who refused to give up on the person he loved second only to his first partner. And a neighborhood reminded that sometimes the purest lesson in humanity comes from a creature who never speaks at all, and yet understands everything that matters.